SBS advises that this program has been classified PG. Parental guidance is recommended.
German tanks charge westward in the Blitzkrieg on France. In a reenactment, shot for the first ever Nazi war documentary in colour. Its title, Artillery Strikes. Only a single copy survived the war. For decades it gathered dust in the German Federal Film Archive. The war was known to generations only in black and white. In colour it has an unprecedented impact. And these scenes are not the only ones that were captured in colour.
Hitler's pilot, an American businessman, German soldiers and Allied cameramen all shared one passion: to film history in colour. Thanks to them, unique records were preserved. Scenes of Nazi terror and Allied resistance, of death at the front and death at home, of crime and retribution, of catastrophic ends and new beginnings. The Second World War was a tragedy of incomprehensible dimensions. When it finally ended, 55 million people had lost their lives, an entire continent lay in ruins, and any hope of peaceful coexistence in Europe seemed gone forever.
One of the monthly newsreels produced by the Halle-Merseburg Regional Film Office, the BDM Dancers. In a camp for the League of German Girls, the Nazi Girls organisation, new recruits practice folk dances. Amateur filmmakers had been filming party functions and training courses for years. But now, in 1938, they could document Nazi Germany with AGFA's new colour film.
Footage of a meeting of the Nazi veterans movement in Freiburg, Sachsen-Anhalt, again commissioned by the Halle-Merseburg Regional Film Office. It wasn't always the key occasions in the Nazi state that were documented on colour film. Much of the footage was buried for decades in state archives and private collections. But the dramatic realism of the colour provides an unusual insight into the period.
A Wehrmacht parade in Mülheim an der Ruhr in 1938. The Third Reich was brazenly rearming, and no one was willing to do anything to stop it. The Treaty of Versailles, which limited Germany's armed forces to 100,000 men, had long since been cast aside. Only 2 years earlier, this city on the River Ruhr was still a demilitarised neutral zone. Now the streets rang once again to the sound of goose-stepping German soldiers.
By 1938, Hitler had ruled Germany for 5 years. Many foreign observers, including former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, believed Hitler's regime had matured. They were impressed by the Autobahns and other Nazi successes. Lloyd George visited Hitler at his Berghof retreat in September 1936. For 3 solid hours, he and Hitler discussed the current situation in Europe and swapped memories of the First World War. Lloyd George was genuinely impressed. He considered the Führer a truly great man. "I only wish we had a man of his supreme quality at the head of affairs in our country today," he wrote to a friend. Churchill would comment in his memoirs, "No one was more completely misled than Mr. Lloyd George." But Lloyd George was far from the only statesman who thought he could persuade Hitler to keep the peace.
So far, the nature of Hitler's true ambitions was evident only in Spain. Since July 1936, the Spanish Civil War had been raging between the nationalist Catholic forces of Francisco Franco and the Socialist Popular Front government. Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to support Franco. With the aid of this Condor Legion, city after city fell to the nationalists. Franco finally won the Civil War in 1939 with German aid. Hitler had hoped that in return, Franco would prove a reliable ally in World War II, but Franco preferred a prudent neutrality.
Meanwhile, young Germans were training. Under the eye of Joachim Egeling, the Gauleiter of Halle-Merseburg, the Hitler Youth held a sports tournament in 1938. The performance by the motorized Hitler Youth proved very popular. For Reich Youth leader Baldur von Schirach, military training for boys was a top priority. The Wehrmacht had recently donated 10,000 small-caliber rifles to the Hitler Youth. "Our goal," a Hitler Youth handbook declared, "is for every German boy to handle a rifle as easily and expertly as he does a fountain pen."
August the 24th, 1938. The entire city of Hamburg is decked out in honour of the Regent of Hungary, Admiral Miklos Horthy. Horthy was making a 5-day state visit to Germany. Hitler wanted to persuade his guest to join him in the imminent carve-up of Czechoslovakia. Hitler's immense popularity with the German people had given him the confidence to begin his campaign of conquest. Every generation, he told one of his aides, should experience a war.
The so-called School and Fatherland Festival in the small town of Mühlberg near Halle, filmed by the Ancestral Heritage Branch of the SS. The seemingly innocuous scenes reveal the reality of National Socialist Germany. The party controlled every aspect of social life. Rearmament was almost complete. Nazi rule had wiped away the shame of Germany's defeat in the First World War. The new pride was symbolized in the slogan, "One people, one Reich, one Führer."
Berlin, summer 1939. The recently completed Reich Chancellery is deserted. Architect Albert Speer had built the gargantuan structure to mirror his Führer's will to power. But Hitler preferred to hatch his plans for the conquest of Poland at a safe distance from his capital. Berliners were all but oblivious to the fact that Europe was on the brink of war. They were enjoying life in the Third Reich to the full, but their halcyon days were numbered.
The Luftwaffe's 77th Fighter Wing in Breslau, East Prussia, now Wrocław in Poland. Future ace Hannes Trautloft was one of its pilots. The Messerschmitt 109...
Not to see it now, because Paris would seem hateful.
Captain Friedrich Gerke of the 23rd Infantry Division was stationed in Montbéliard near the French-Swiss border. As a quartermaster, he was constantly on the move looking for supplies. Shortly after the French surrender, he had bought a camera and some Kodak color film in Paris. He used it to document the good times the Germans enjoyed during the occupation. In autumn 1940, Gerke and his men went on a special mission in the unoccupied south of France, collecting wines and spirits. They travelled extensively through the Bordeaux region and visited the seaside resort of Biarritz. Never mind that most people they met resented or despised them. They wanted to enjoy the fruits of victory while they could. After all, it was anybody's guess how long this life of luxury might last.
Paris, December 1940. German soldiers on the Champs-Élysées. They were filmed by a German officer with his 16mm camera. The conquerors had settled into the French capital. Some 20,000 German soldiers were in the city, and the victors left no doubt about who was now in charge.
The swastika flag flies over the German commandant's office. For French Jews, the occupation meant more than the unwelcome presence of foreign troops. It meant the introduction of Nazi anti-Jewish laws into France. From early November 1940, all Jewish businesses were systematically Aryanized, and all Jews had to register with the authorities. Those who had the means or the connections fled the country. Their possessions found their way to Paris flea markets to be picked over by bargain hunters and curiosity seekers like these visiting Germans.
The vanquished now lived behind barbed wire. 25,000 French prisoners of war were herded into this camp in Hemer, near Dortmund. A sentry, Hugo Filbrich, captured scenes from camp life. He was especially interested in French colonial soldiers, Arabs and Africans. Did these pictures reflect his natural curiosity, or the racism of Nazi ideology?
The Dachau concentration camp, just outside Munich. Dachau held over 20,000 German opponents of the Nazis, political prisoners from occupied territories, and Jews. In winter 1940, a baker from the town of Dachau shot this unique footage inside the vast complex. He regularly supplied bread to the camp canteen. Several of the prisoners worked for him in the bakery. As a result, the SS guards evidently had no objection to his filming even the notorious roll call yard. These are the only known pictures of the Dachau camp prior to its liberation in 1945.
Across the Atlantic in Miami, the USS Tuscaloosa was ready to sail in December 1940. President Roosevelt was aboard the cruiser for a 2-week trip to the Caribbean. Officially, the United States was neutral in the war. Only 8% of Americans thought the United States should join it. But Roosevelt knew only too well that sooner or later the United States would have to intervene. He had ordered a massive expansion of arms production. Roosevelt was particularly concerned about the plight of Britain, and he received the new British governor of the Bahamas for an exchange of views. The Duke of Windsor had been relegated to this outpost by Winston Churchill a few months earlier. The former King Edward VIII was widely regarded as a Nazi sympathiser.
But with the Luftwaffe bombing London night after night, the most pro-German Britons had now lost all sympathy for Hitler. In spring 1941, the amateur filmmaker Rosie Newman shot these sequences for a report on the home front. German bombs had fallen near Bond Street, causing major damage. Over 1,200 Londoners lost their lives during the 1941 raids. Time and again, Rosie's position behind the camera brought astonished reactions. A policeman, checking her permit to film, commented curtly, "I had no idea girls were used for this kind of work."
In retaliation, the Royal Air Force began to bomb German cities. For the first time, the war that the Wehrmacht had spread over half of Europe was rebounding on Germany. British bombers attacked Neuwied, a small town on the Rhine, on the night of the 1st of March 1941. 12 people died in the raid. The townspeople gathered in the market square to make their final farewells. But none of them had any idea of the terror that the coming air war would bring.
For months, Hitler and his generals had been gearing up for their next major campaign, the invasion of the Soviet Union. In the meantime, Italy's dictator Mussolini had bitten off more than he could chew. He had attacked British territories in Africa and invaded Greece. Hitler had to come to his rescue.
In April 1941, German troops occupied both Yugoslavia and Greece in a matter of weeks. The Luftwaffe attacked targets around the clock. When the Greek capital capitulated, the Luftwaffe already controlled Elefsis airport near Athens. The soldiers had some time for sightseeing. One filmed a knocked-out German tank and soldiers' graves at Thermopylae, scene of the ancient battle. From their headquarters in Athens, the Germans would impose a harsh regime on occupied Greece for the next 3 years. Hostages would be shot, Greek Jews would be deported to death camps. But none of this features in the soldiers' films. They were basking in the euphoria of victory.
Germany, summer 1941. Vacationers at Lake Chiemsee presented a deceptively calm picture. For Germany was about to invade the Soviet Union. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "We are all trembling with anticipation. I can hardly wait for the storm to break. This evening the new weekly newsreel is out. Terrific. I'm staying in Schwanenwerder. A redolent evening. How beautiful the world can be."
The resident of number 12 Wasserburger Strasse in Munich was also going on vacation. Hitler's mistress, Eva Braun, was going to Italy, taking a camera and colour film with her. Hitler's pilot, Hans Bauer, personally flew the holiday party over the Alps. It included Eva's mother Fanny, her sister Gretel, and Annie Brandt, wife of Hitler's personal physician. While German troops were massing along the German-Soviet line of demarcation in East Prussia and Poland, the ladies were relaxing at Paragi, near Portofino.
At dawn on the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. When the 20th Panzer Division left East Prussia to seize Byelorussia, 21-year-old Götz-Hirt Reger went with it. He was a radio operator. A few months earlier, he had scavenged a few rolls of Kodak color film in occupied Warsaw. Now he used it to shoot exceptional footage of the German advance. Within a month, the Germans had pushed deep into the Ukraine. On July the 16th, Smolensk fell, and even Moscow seemed within their grasp.
Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner. Hitler had ordered the immediate execution of all political commissars. The others were crowded into makeshift POW camps. Those who survived were deported to Germany to do forced labour. Fascinated by the war and its destruction, Götz-Hirt Reger used his last reel of colour film in August 1941. When he submitted the film for developing, it was confiscated. However, the authorities were so impressed by his camera work that he wasn't arrested for filming against orders. Instead, he was transferred to train as a cameraman for Goebbels' propaganda ministry. His footage ends with this German military cemetery. 4 years later, there would be hundreds of such cemeteries in the East. Final resting places for those fallen German soldiers, lucky enough to get a burial at all.
At roughly the same time, an Allied armada was lying at anchor in the port of Halifax in the Canadian province of Nova Scotia. Freighters and troop transports assembled there before commencing the perilous voyage to England. The once sleepy Halifax was now a throbbing garrison town, complete with troop support services and nightclubs, for a last good time before frontline service overseas.
Also in August 1941, Winston Churchill visited Canada. He would shortly be joining President Roosevelt to announce the Atlantic Charter, a statement of their goals for the post-war world. But first, the victory had to be won.
Fire! Fire! Fire!
Scenes from a Canadian documentary.
In war, a nation must be forthright, for the art of war is largely the ability to marshal the entire resources of a people: ships, tanks, planes, and guns. But for the tanks, planes, and ships, men were needed. And on the storied cobbles of Halifax, the tramp of armed men beat a savage rhythm. War, 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 war.
On August the 28th, Hitler and Mussolini visited German and Italian troops in the Ukraine. The German dictator was at the height of his power. No one since Napoleon had dominated such a vast area of Europe. Russia would henceforth be ruled by Germans, Hitler proclaimed. Very soon, its vast territory would become Lebensraum, living space for German settlers.
From the very outset, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was a war of annihilation. Scenes from the town of Pleskow in the Ukraine. Behind the lines, Himmler's execution squads had begun the mass extermination of the Jewish population. From time to time, regular troops of the German army also took part. On the Eastern Front, the
The Germans occupied Kirovograd in the Ukraine on August the 5th, 1941. Pioneer Battalion 219 was quartered nearby. A member of the unit, Pioneer Voigt, was a keen photographer, and he filmed his comrades at work and at play. Their job was to repair bridges behind the front lines. He filmed candid shots of an idyll that was about to turn into a nightmare for these men in just a few weeks. The headlong German advance of July and August would soon be halted by the harsh Russian winter. The Pioneer Battalion optimistically built log cabins as a refuge from the freezing cold. Hitler's Blitzkrieg in the east ground to a halt in ice and snow.
Hawaii, February 1942. The island paradise was the latest theatre of war. On December the 7th, 1941, Japanese warplanes had attacked the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The raid turned the airbase at Hickam Field into a giant scrapyard, with 77 US aircraft destroyed on the ground. The Japanese lost 29. Nazi Germany, too, had declared war on the United States. America mobilized to strike back. The first step was to send reinforcements to Honolulu in case of a Japanese invasion.
Hollywood director John Ford was sent to Pearl Harbor to document the war effort. He and his team witnessed the aftermath of the December 7th attack. Hawaii these days is truly a strange place, he reported in a letter. Barbed wire everywhere, belated safety measures of all kinds. The hysteria of this defensive mood is very confusing to me.
The next step was to strike back at Japan. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, launched an attack on Tokyo as early as April 1942. The head of the Japanese fleet, Admiral Yamamoto, was already planning his own next move. He wanted to mount a second surprise attack to seize the US base on the island of Midway. But the Americans had cracked his codes. They were lying in wait for Yamamoto's invasion fleet. In the Battle of Midway, in June 1942, the Japanese lost all 4 of the large carriers they had used to attack Pearl Harbor. It was the turning point of the war in the Pacific.
John Ford and his cameraman Jack Mackenzie had flown to Midway 2 weeks earlier. Their job was to cover the battle. They got a vantage point on the roof of the power station. From there, on the morning of the 4th of June, they shot unprecedented footage. Ford was wounded in the battle. He was decorated with the Purple Heart. He also won an Oscar for his documentary, The Battle of Midway.
US war production was now in full swing. And with the men away fighting, women took over the factories. A 1942 film called on women to take their place in industry. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt gave the campaign her personal patronage.
At the present time, it is of paramount importance that the women and girls of our country be given training so that they may do their share in the war emergency. To some of us, the National Youth Administration stands out as the agency which is doing the best job along these lines at present.
Despite the Japanese defeat at Midway, the American population remained apprehensive. There were fears of Japanese air raids, and even of a direct German attack on the United States. This training film explained what to do in an emergency.
There should not be time to reach the air raid room. Pupils are taught quick ways of self-protection. The school offers many such places of refuge, which boys and girls should learn how and when to use. Must the fate of these young children be that of thousands in the conquered lands? The answer is no. Therefore, let us prepare ourselves for anything to come, from the superintendent down to the pupils in the school. All must help. Let us join the triumphant march toward victory.
Saturday, World War II as you've never seen it.
A parade in honour of the Führer in Linz, Austria. Colour footage previously unpublished from a private collector's archive.
World War II in colour.
The troops are poised for the decisive blow against the Third Reich. Their target, Berlin.
7:30 next Saturday on As It Happened.
If we're serious about the financial security